Hello, boys and girls. Today, I'm going to tell you a story in a violent nature. Hello, welcome back to my world of stuff. I've just watched a horror film. Not necessarily an unusual thing in itself, except that horror isn't my genre of choice. My horror tastes, I think I'm probably happier with the sort of Hammer and Amicus films of the 60s and 70s. And of course, the classic Universal horror films. I'm not a massive fan of modern horror, but there have been some good titles over the last few years. I'm thinking of things like Smile, thinking of Black Phone, Barbarian, some quite good, intense, creepy horror films that are as much thrillers as horror films. What I don't do, you'd have to pay me to do, is your Screams and your Saws and your Jigsaws and all these stabby films. I'm not a fan of those sorts of films. I'm not a fan of films that put people, young people or otherwise, in intense terror of being slashed to pieces. Especially in the current climate where knife crime is such a big social concern. And that's not me being touchy-feely and angsty. It's just that I think that stabbing is just something so brutal and so savage and raw. I just can't imagine how somebody could do it to somebody, much less suffer, the pain of having it done. But that's a whole other issue. So I'm not a big fan of those sorts of films. So the film I've just watched, In a Violent Nature, is absolutely not the sort of film I'd necessarily expect to see, because there's a bit of stabbing in it, there's all sorts in it. This is an incredibly strong film. You will need a titanium-lined stomach, I think, to get through this one, because this is a tough one. What's interesting about this film is that it is very much in that sort of genre of Friday the 13th and Nightmare on Elm Street and Halloween, all those films about masked lunatic stalking killers who slash and maim and kill and dismember and disembowel. But this is done in a different way, and I think what I liked about this film was the way it was made, was the way it was directed and put together, because it isn't just, and I'm not even saying not even, because I think it is to an extent just an exploitative, slashy horror film, but it's done in a very different way. This is coming out in the UK this weekend if you're interested in seeing it, but as I said, you will need a strong stomach because it is pretty graphic. The scenes of gore are pretty gory, and it has a very intense atmosphere to it because the whole story is played out without any music at all. All you get is a credit card, In a Violent Nature, but there's no incidental music. There's none of that sort of dramatic build up to the moments of horror. You're just pitched into the story. The only music is a song that plays over the credits at the end of the film. So what's this about? I've rambled on about it now for 3.5 minutes. It is, in a way, your classic cabin in the woods horror film. Now, that's one thing I don't understand about North American kids. This obsession with the great outdoors. I mean, the great outdoors, the great indoors, I know which I prefer. I prefer the one that's got a roof. I'm not a big fan of wide open spaces and forests and woods. I've no interest in those environments. But obviously, without them, we wouldn't have a certain strain of American horror films, that cabin in the woods genre of films. This is in that genre, but it's very different in the way that the story is told. Story basically is about Johnny, played by Ry Barrett. And I'm not going to mention particularly the names of any of the actors in this film. You don't know any of them. The only one I suppose you need to know is the one who plays the killer. Is a character called Johnny, and we hear in the film that 20 odd years ago Johnny was the slightly mentally retarded son of a local farmer. He was tormented and bullied and terrorised, and eventually one of the tricks that was played on him went horribly wrong and he fell from a great height and died. But his spirit has been restless ever since, and it's only a locket from his mother which has kept his spirit under control. He's buried out in the woods. When a bunch of kids enjoying a cabin in the woods break find this locket and decide it'll be a good idea to take it, Johnny emerges like a zombie from the ground. I've seen it described as a zombie film, and it really isn't a zombie film. Here's this restless, tormented spirit that comes back. So he's resurrected and he goes on a rampage throughout the woods. He kills anybody who comes into contact with, including this bunch of kids in a cabin in the woods. And that's the basic story. But what's interesting about this film, what's different about this film, what makes it memorable is the way that it's made. This is written and directed by Chris Nash. And this is a film which is told pretty much from the perspective of Johnny himself. You see it all almost Johnny's eye view as he's walking through the forest. And he does a lot of walking. He gets his steps in this film, I can tell you. And you see these long, languid shots of him just walking remorselessly and endlessly through the forests until he comes across something of interest or someone of interest. And it's very atmospheric. It's done almost in a documentary style. The camera itself is a character in the film. It's done in this faux documentary style where you're just following this man. You do see his face at one point, but he's sort of masked and hidden. And at another point, he breaks into a ranger's cabin and steals this sort of gas mask type thing, a hunter's mask. And it's about him, just following him, walking through the woods for a minute on end. And a lot of it's done in long shot. The camera stays well back. I don't think there's any more than a handful of close-ups in this film. It's all done in extreme long shots and shots from above, drone shots, and distant. You don't get to see the features of many of the characters, really, because it is done at a distance to sort of keep you at arm's length from the action, yet you're in the action. A lot of shots of the countryside and the environment, which again becomes a character in the film because you're immersed in it. You get these scenes of misty woods and a misty lake and just low shots of the ground. It's very interesting the way it's done. And this is what kept me particularly interested because it is so unusual in the way that it's done in this sort of, I think it's described as an ambient horror film because it's all about atmosphere and it's all about the dread that you feel as you see this creature just walking along, and then you see people in the distance coming closer and he just walks remorselessly towards them and does what he does. And what he does is pretty grotesque. So as I said, I'll say it again. If you're of a nervous disposition, you don't like gore and graphic violence, this ain't the film for you. But I found it really very striking indeed. Very striking. I love the way it inverts that cabin in the wood thing because you don't really get to know any of these kids. Not really. You sort of see them. There's one or two brief establishing scenes, but it's not about them. And I suppose if there's a criticism, you could say that you find it hard to care for these characters because you don't know them really apart from their names here and there. But it doesn't really detract from the film because it's so powerful. The way it's made is so powerful and so unusual and so disturbing. Because as I said, you haven't got all those things that you expect in these films. You haven't got the overwhelming music that tells you when to be scared or warns you that something terrible is going to happen. Things just happen and you're following this creature. And this is the striking image of the film. This man thing just walking purposefully through the forest with a camera behind him. Very, very unusual film. Very memorable. And I think it is one that'll stick in the memory because it is so bold and stripped back and unique. I suppose that in Johnny we have a new sort of cinema slasher killer. I don't know if we're going to see a sequel to this film. I think it was probably quite low budget and hasn't had a wide release, so it hasn't made a ton of money as low budget horror films do. I can see there being a sequel because it's sort of left open for it, but I almost hope it doesn't get one because I think it stands as something stark and different, hewn from the elements that we're so used to in slasher films. Very, very interesting film, which is in cinemas. I think it's got a limited cinema release in the UK starting next Friday. So I would say if you like your horror films and your stomach is able to cope with some nastiness, give it a go. Very unusual. Very much not the sort of film I normally talk about on this channel because it's not my sort of thing. But this is very well made, quite disturbing. In a Violent Nature in cinemas from next weekend. Hard to rate it in a way because in some ways it's an ugly film, but in some ways I admired the artistry of it. And because of that, I'm going to give it 8 out of 10. 8 out of 10 in A Violent Nature. Right, thank you for watching this video. Hope you've enjoyed it. It's not the usual sort of Doctor Who stuff that I do, but as I've tried to say before, this channel isn't just about Doctor Who. This is about all sorts of entertainment, films and books and TV and things. And I thought this was one that was worth talking about. So if you've liked this video, you know what to do. Press that subscribe button, wherever it is. Like, leave a thumbs up, leave a comment down below if you've seen this film, or if you're interested in seeing this film, if you're planning to see this film. It might be one that's sailed under your radar, because I say it's not got wide cinema release because it's sort of summer and there's lots of big blockbusters. But if you're looking for something rather different and unnerving in the horror genre, I recommend it. So yeah, leave a comment down below, like and subscribe. I'll see you soon. Until I do, keep taking the stuff.